All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode. I'm excited to have Ellery here, who was just fresh off of speaking at PI Apparel, which is a big conference for basically innovation in the apparel space. So I'm going to hand it over to him to just give a quick intro of himself, and then we'll dive into the topic.
Cool, thanks, Mike. Yeah, I'm Ellery Connell, and yeah, just did recently speak at PI Apparel at the Stride event, which was footwear specific. A little bit of my background: I've been working in 3D design and visualization, one type of another, for about 30 years. So I've seen a lot of innovation in that time. I've seen a lot of changes, a lot of capabilities come and progress and evolve. So it's been an interesting space. I've spent about the last decade largely focused in footwear and apparel. And in that space, a lot of that time has been spent on, um, you know, I, optimizing tools and workflows for the existing processes within those industries, and just how to get better adoption of 3D design, which is obviously a significantly different beast to tackle than 2D design. So, yeah, happy to be here and nice to chat with you.
Excellent. Yeah. So, how do you find the adoption has been with manufacturers? Is everybody using 3D now, or is it still kind of split?
I'd say everybody's using it to an extent. I mean, now has everybody used it full scale and is using it, across all their product lines and everything? Not so much. I think
Mhm.
that's kind of where the big challenge is. But I think if you haven't at least dabbled in pulling in some 3D design in one way or another in your processes, um, then you're probably out of the loop. But I would say probably everybody is to at least some extent.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. And yeah, we were talking about this the other day, and I think one of the opportunities for a lot of brands is still connecting the dots all the way through to the final product visualization, and maybe even connecting that back. In previous episodes, this has been a topic too of how do you like
Mm.
incorporate that product insight and consumer, awareness or whatever feedback into that product like 3D design and then have a nice iteration. It does feel like there's an opportunity if they're designing the content in 3D to begin with, even internally as part of that review process to leverage a 3D model like digital twin ahead of like physically building samples, right? Like, what do you find is the typical like product development life cycle look like?
In a lot of ways, when we're talking about like digital product creation, it hasn't really changed the cycle all that much over what had been done prior with either digital 2D visualization or not non-digital visualization, pen and paper kind of stuff. Um, I think that's kind of where there's a big hiccup right now. That 3D has gotten itself into the process enough to where it's not new. It's not something that, oh, are we going to adopt this or not? You're probably going to want to use it in some way or another. But the usage of it has been kind of split in a few different ways. There's kind of um, the design part of it. And that's the part that I think is still kind of most uncomfortable. It's like using it for a designer, for somebody who would probably be more comfortable with paper and pencils and traditional media, and then to some extent Photoshop, Illustrator, 2D illustration. They'd be much more comfortable than they would be with creating a 3D model. But that is kind of one
Mhm.
space that it exists in. There's like the manufacturing industrial space. A lot of stuff, like you look at like footwear, tooling, outsoles, midsoles. That stuff has to be manufactured. There have to be molds made. So there, a lot of times there's CAD. So there's 3D of that. So there's kind of that more technical 3D side. And then there's hey, we just want it to look like a real shoe. And, kind of a lot of stuff we've seen like in the auto industry, even before now, a lot, quite a ways before, where, hey, well, let's just use something for advertising purposes. So, we can do whatever we want with a shoe or a garment or something in a digital space that would be really difficult to film. And then there's no such thing as having to tear down the space or anything. So we kind of see it at that tail end, at the beginning when we're doing the design, and then the kind of industrial, CAD area, and that's needed for production. I think it's the difficulty of getting really a lot of high comfort level at the design stage is maybe one of the biggest hiccups that we're hitting though right now. And it's kind of one of the
Mhm.
things that keeps it from, creating one big cohesive process. And I think a lot of those things kind of need to plug together a bit better.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And I think sort of some of the challenges like the materials, right? So getting good physical samples
Mhm.
of those materials or digital samples of the physical product into an environment where you can just kind of quickly and easily apply it. I know, like on our end, when we're creating content, especially from scratch, we'll find that we have to just kind of tweak settings, and you're looking at different photographs or different angles and trying to understand how is the light really interacting with this to make it look
Right.
believable. And if you kind of cut that out and you have a nice digital library of all your materials and you can just quickly like slap them on, it feels like, especially in the design phase, you could probably iterate through different configurations kind of quickly and then maybe even put some of those in front of the consumer pre-production and kind of see which ones gather the most interest, right? So if a product's going to fail, maybe it's just they picked the wrong colorways right early on, and if they
Yeah.
had more input or the quicker ability to kind of test different combinations, maybe that helps speed up the process and produce a better product in the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think that's kind of one of the it's one of the there's like a handful of pieces that I think that if we're, fully leveraged, at the earlier, like that design phase, like we're talking about, that are gonna add, you know more emphasis to it being important than just, hey, it gives us a better visualization. I mean, it's one thing for a designer to be like, hey, I'm working on this shoe, and I really know what it looks like from the side, and then like I look at it from the top and go, oh, is that what it looks like from the top? Whereas if you're largely just working from a profile, it's kind of
Mhm.
difficult to necessarily visualize the top, or even if in your head, it's as the designer, it's difficult to communicate that. um so there's one thing, and that's, yeah, that's a real benefit to be able to say, oh, I really know how I wanted this to look from the side, but it's difficult to communicate how I want that to look from a different angle, or how that actually translates to what it's going to be on a foot, as opposed to just
Mhm.
as opposed to a more illustrative version. So there's a lot of benefit there, and I think that's kind of the thing that we see is the easy to visualize benefit of 3D in the design process. But yeah, the more you have a not necessarily perfect, but a closer version, and a lot of that can be, yeah, to your point, a library of realistic looking materials, a library of good looking lighting, and um, contextualized lighting, so we can see what it looks like, not just in studio lighting, but what it's going to look like,
Mhm.
basketball court. Let's see what it looks like on hardwood, and bright interior lighting. Let's see if it's a lifestyle shoe. Let's see what it looks like out on the street in daylight, and that kind of thing. If you can do that kind of thing with realistic materials and realistic lighting without the model having to be perfect, then, well, that makes it a lot easier for your designer, and then whoever is going to sign off on it and do approvals and that kind of thing. It makes it easier for them. But then the other thing is, it gives you the opportunity to say, well, who else might want to look at this at a design phase? Who else might want to see a little bit behind the scenes to say, I'd buy that. And and
Right.
and
Yeah. Your
ultimately, if
test
somebody's going to
audience.
say, I'm
Yeah.
going to buy that, then that's the end goal. It's the big difference between like our VFX and our game design, the stuff that's been doing 3D a lot prior. At the end, they're just working on a project that's going to stay digital, whereas somebody has to go down to the shelf and pick it off and say, yeah, I want to online, click and say, I want to buy that, and hand over their money. So that end goal obviously has to be the key priority. But the more you can better connect with that customer, especially earlier on in the design phase, I think the better you are off to make good use of the good design that the designers are doing.
Yeah, totally. And I think a lot of this kind of ties back to the return on investment that a company might see if they start utilizing 3D more, right? Like, do you find that there's hesitation for, maybe budget allocation, or is it more hesitation on learning a new workflow? Like, where's the kind of bottleneck right now for folks
Yes.
just jumping in all in?
I'd say a little bit of both. I've described it a few times as kind of like an adoption sandwich. Like, it has to be palatable uh to the financial decisions of the company. Hey, is it, we're going to spend X number of dollars on implementing this. We have to see that our ROI is going to be something valuable, or else it's not worth it for us to do it. But then you also have to make it palatable to the person who's going to be using the tools, which means
Mhm.
that they have to feel comfortable enough. Especially we're talking about design, we're talking about creative. There's a very difficult to capture portion of that, where if you don't feel comfortable with the tools that you're using, you're not going to get the best out of your design. So even if it could help you communicate it better, if you as a designer aren't comfortable using it, it's like if you've spent your whole life working in watercolor, and somebody all of a sudden hands you, you know, uh, charcoal, and you're like, okay, I'm sure I could do beautiful things with this, but I don't, it's not my medium. So we're looking at something that isn't the medium of the designers. And the more it can get adopted as their medium, the more they see the benefit of it, and the more they feel comfortable with it, to say, oh, now I feel like I can actually explore with it, instead of just say, okay, I did my sketch and now I have to translate it into a 3D model. The better
Mhm.
it can be adopted. But yeah, you definitely have to see it coming from both sides, because it could be the best, most creative, fun tool, but if it loses the company money, then it's hard to sustain long term, or to scale, across the board.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I know you've done a lot of help in the past with tools like Moto, right? Getting
Mhm,
people up and running and figuring that out. How has that like landscape changed? You mentioned like Clo and Browsewares as some other
mhm.
tools that are out there. Like, what are people typically using on the design side for software?
Yeah, Clo and Browseware have obviously been super important for the apparel industry. I'll often make the joke that, in footwear they don't have a Clo and a Browseware. I mean, there are some tools that are a little bit more geared towards, just making a shoe, but they've kind of lacked that creative side um that makes them really really usable by a designer. But yeah, Clo and Browseware have been super big. They simplify the process enough, I think, that it makes it so the adoption isn't quite as big, which is cool. You're not looking at something and going, okay, to start using 3D, I need to learn this huge suite of tools. Whereas it's just like, okay, I have to know how to do some things to be able to get my design from a pattern into a 3D wrapped, simulated piece of fabric that looks like clothing. Footwear doesn't really have that. Moto, yeah, as you mentioned, what was a big one. It was really well geared for it. It both had a pretty approachable interface, and then also had some tools that were well optimized over the years to kind of make footwear design a bit easier. I helped on a bunch
Mhm.
of those, and got a lot of feedback on them to be able to kind of improve them. So when um, Moto was end of life, I think they announced it like last September, October, so late last year. Um, Honestly, I think that's left a bigger hole in the creative industry for footwear than we've fully realized yet. Um, you can
Mhm.
still download and use it, so I think some companies are still kind of holding on to it a little bit to try to transition out. There have been lots of other tools that have gotten really good over the years. Blender, for one, has gotten extremely
Oh
good
yeah.
for a tool that's free. I know some companies are really, really hesitant to use something that's open source, either for fear of, maybe data privacy. I don't think it's an issue, but you kind of get the perception of it. But then also in terms of, support, how do we have support? How do we know for sure that, we have feedback to somebody that's going to help make the tools better for us? Um, and then a lot of the other 3D tools haven't done a ton to kind of focus in on that. So you've got great 3D tools like Maya 3D Max, Cinema 4D. They're all, really good, solid tools that could totally do any of this stuff. You'll see if you look up and pick, you know, 3D footwear, insert 3D tool name, you're going to see some good work done by it. But the difference is
Mhm.
that's done by a 3D artist, somebody who enjoys the getting in and playing with it and figuring out the problems, not somebody who's saying, I got this design and I want to put it on the screen so I can share it. And there's a big difference. Um, yeah, and then real time obviously has gotten much better as far as like the rendering side. So tools like Unreal and NVIDIA Omniverse are really
Mhm.
really good. The visual quality is phenomenal. Getting in real time now, where stuff we used to expect waiting a minute or 10 minutes or 20 minutes for, or going back into my early days. Click, I'll be back in an hour and see what that little 320 by 240
Yeah,
pixel
that little
render looks
render
like.
would be, and that's the preview one, right? And then you run it
Yeah,
overnight to get the
then you
final
gotta render the
final
high res
quality.
one. Yeah, but like
Yeah.
Unreal, especially I've done a lot of work with Unreal. I've been working on actually on and off with Unreal since 2007. 2008.
Oh,
It's been
yeah.
a
Oh,
long
good.
time.
So, yeah,
So I've
that's a
been
good,
in and out of it for
good
a long
history with it.
time, not constantly through that whole time, but I've kind of it's been nice to watch that tool evolve. And like now the way it is, it's an extremely good tool for visualization. I kind of hoping to see Epic Games kind of do a bit more work in that area. To kind
Mhm.
of optimize the tool set for for working with footwear and apparel and kind of helping close some of those pipelines, bring that design closer to what can be put in front of a customer. But there are a couple of other tools in there, like I said, NVIDIA Omniverse, another one with kind of similar quality, different back end, different interface, that kind of thing, but very, very capable tools. Honestly, I think there's a fair chunk of market right now that's kind of up for grabs, especially on the footwear side, because since footwear's fresh, since we just did the Stride event. But I think
Yeah.
in footwear, there's a prime opportunity for anybody who wants to come in and just slightly tweak those tools to make them more easily adopted by footwear designers. There's a big market to be able to grab. So I'm kind of curious to see how that goes.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And, we were discussing this earlier in the week about how the game companies and the VFX companies, they have these big in-house engineering teams, and they'll typically, if they need a tool, to tweak some little thing, whether it's some type of grass or fur or whatever it is, like
Yeah,
they'll build that tool in
yeah,
code themselves for that particular project. And yeah, we don't really have the same level of capability or interest or just structure within a commerce environment. You
yeah,
have folks that are maybe doing like the web development or some of the engineering work, but they're not typically doing 3D engineering, right? there's
yeah.
there's few exceptions. Like when we were at Wayfair, we did have like a 3D tools team that
Oh,
was
cool.
building out ways for us to improve our automation and our throughput, but they were a pretty large company with a good amount of resources to invest, and we were kind of mirroring a lot of what the game world was doing anyway. Like we'd hire folks that were coming from there and could bring in their best practices. Like, how do you think that's going to evolve in this space? Are teams going to invest in it, or is that the opportunity you were talking about where software companies can make these tools for them?
I think I would definitely lean towards it's an opportunity for the software developers. I just have a hard time, and I've spent time kind of running around in circles, thought process on this, trying to think, is there a way that it seems like a good idea for a company to invest in like a development team like that. And I got to be honest, I just can't see a way that it is, mostly because if you take the examples of VFX games, that kind of stuff, what they typically need as far as new tool development tends to be new with each project. I've used the example of Pixar a lot, how they had to develop methods for creating more realistic snow. They had to have more realistic long hair. They had to have more realistic whatever, insert whatever was needed for each film. And then that stuff goes into their tool set and it gets used for the next project, and it gets
Mhm,
developed and kind of tweaked all throughout the project. So it's not like they develop the beginning of the project and say, see you later, guys. No, that still has to be tweaked and adjusted until the film's over, and then they're on to the next project. Whereas if you look at footwear and apparel, they might need a new tool set at the beginning, and then the next time they're going to need something like that developed might be years down the line. It might be the next time we totally change gears and do something different. Kind of like the switch from 2D to 3D. So, you
mhm,
know,
yeah.
and it's not like you can just go hire one person, one dude, one
Right, you
gal,
got
bring
to
them in
build
and
a
say, yeah,
team,
build all this
train
tool
them.
suite for us, and then we'll kind of
Yeah,
keep you on doing other stuff. You can't really do that. You need a team. And I've seen that actually
right.
that is an issue with software companies too, where they have a really small team in one particular area, and then they try to make that small team compete with another company that's their entire engineering staff is geared towards that, and it ends up spreading the other team too thin, because then you're pulling away people from your core competency to do something else. I think we'd see the same kind of thing
Mhm,
there. You can't spread those teams too thin, within like a brand company. So it's a hard time to see that makes sense for hiring somebody long term. But then it would be a really difficult business model for the software developers, or those those kind of teams to like go work for one company for 6 months and then go work for another, because those companies aren't going to stack and wait for another two or three other companies 6, 12, 18 months for them to finish development so that they can hire those people. No, because they want to keep up
mhm.
with their with their competition. So it makes far more sense, in my opinion, to have the the software tool companies do that work. The only thing is they have to know what to do, and that's where you hit such a big disconnect. Your footwear designers know real well all the pieces and parts and bits and bobs of a shoe and what they need to be able to communicate their design. And the software company knows real well how to build their software and tweak it and make it do whatever you need to do, but they don't know what the footwear designer needs unless they talk to each other. And they have done that a little,
Mhm.
but not really enough because
But we need
it's
more.
it's
Yeah.
hard. It's not an easy thing to say, "Hey, this group of people needs this to happen, and this is what they need on a technical level to actually make that happen on the software." That's that's a communication, gap that is kind of plagued this industry for the last decade, and probably will until they start to connect a little bit more.
Yeah, and what I've observed too on the 3D side is that, companies are a little hesitant to invest too many resources into it because they kind
Sure.
of consider it as like an extra, enhanced feature instead
Yeah.
of a core feature. And I think this opportunity or this conversation is a little bit more of a core feature, right? If you're using the 3D tools to reduce the amount of turnaround time, get better feedback, maybe physically produce less samples
Mhm.
between, design phases, then maybe it's a little bit different because it's a direct cost savings or direct time
Right.
savings, which essentially is the same thing. And instead of just leveraging the 3D for marketing purposes, they get that as like a bonus and it's
Mhm.
still nice to have, but the core value that they're adding is maybe around that product development life cycle.
Yeah. Yeah, I know when we were chatting the other day, I mentioned, I think there's a good opportunity. In my imagination, I see it as kind of like a mid-size developer. I mean, talking kind of more specifically about footwear, but I think this is also true of apparel and other kind of consumer development areas. But I see it a lot in footwear where I think there's an opportunity for kind of a more mid-size company, small to mid-size, that's a little bit more agile to say, you know what,
It's a
hey,
little smaller
screw it,
than like
we're
Epic
just gonna
Games.
yeah, we're gonna
Yeah.
dive in and we're gonna redo our process. We're gonna spend the investment that we need to, maybe temporarily we need to bring some 3D artists on contract so they can help us move through. I don't know what that's gonna look like, but I can kind of see like an opportunity for a company to say, we're gonna use this not just to get it across the spectrum of our design process, but we're gonna use it to say, who needs 18 months to design a shoe? We're going to take a shoe and, in the summertime, we're going to have it on the shelves for Christmas. I mean, you say
Yeah.
that
That's
you say
something
that
we
with
haven't seen in
previous
that
options, and
industry.
it's like
Yeah.
that's never possible. But it actually is possible with the tools that are already there. It's just, can they get adopted and implemented in a way that will allow it to happen? I think there's an opportunity for that. And I think once somebody does that, and I think it's been done on small scales to a bit, to be fair. But if somebody's able to do that with their, most or all of their product line, I think everybody's gonna kind of have to wake up and say, well, if they can and are doing that, if we want to keep up, we have to do it too. And that might be the impetus either for more investment to be able to allow, software companies to have contracts to get this stuff done, get the tool set built up, or allow opportunities for something, but to allow it to kind of happen more, universally. At which point I see we'll kind of finally tick over, and we'll get to that point of, okay, yeah, now this is necessary. We can't go back because everybody else
Yeah,
is that much
definitely.
closer to market. We can't say, oh, you know what, everybody else can have designs turned around in 3 to 6 months. But we're not going to do that. That's not
We're
really an
gonna stick with
option if your
18 months.
competition's
Yeah,
doing
people
it.
aren't gonna do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm hoping
Yeah, I
that's
do
I'm
like to.
hoping that's the case. I think it would be really interesting to see.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, I always think of that, when I'm talking about future technology is would you ever go backwards, right? And a lot of times, once you make
Mhm.
that switch,
Yeah.
there's no way you'd go back, right? And so, just that time saving examples you're talking about there makes a lot of sense. And so, yeah, I would hope that we'll see over the next, I don't know, couple years, I suppose, that
Yeah.
type of tool emerge.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, like the game engines have gotten so good at real time,
Right.
reproduction that
Managing
used to
assets,
be a
all that stuff.
barrier, I think, for folks
Yeah.
to adopt 3D is it didn't maybe look as realistic, and
Mhm.
that argument's kinda going away,
Yeah, for sure.
and then you mix in AI tools and other things that can
Yeah.
maybe help streamline the process, and it does yeah, it just seems like, the opportunity is getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Cool.
Cool.
Well, I wanna, as we're getting closer to the end of our time segment, just give you a chance to kind of ping or plug any other, projects you're working on, ways that people can get in touch with you.
Yeah,
Where are you best found on social media these days?
probably easiest to find me on LinkedIn. So you can look me up, Ellery Connell on LinkedIn. We can probably put a link in the description or something. Um, I have a YouTube channel that's been fairly deprecated. I used to do a lot more tutorials, training videos, just kind of general purpose kind of stuff. A lot of it's still, if you're brand new to 3D, it's kind of cool. I've got a lot of stuff around Modo, which hey, if you want a free tool and you just want to learn some 3D, hey, you can go get it as a free tool and you can follow a bunch of my Modo stuff. Um, and yeah, project wise, I've worked on a little bit of everything the last few years. I've worked in VR. I have a patent for VR capture of live events. I've worked in, like I said, a lot in the kind of footwear apparel industries, and then a lot in just kind of training, education, tool adoption, that kind of stuff. Um, yeah, if you have any questions or anything, by all means, reach out on LinkedIn and ping me, and we can talk.
Yeah, and are you open to, like, consulting and helping
Yeah,
companies that are
I'm
trying to
fairly
struggle
open
with
to
this? Yeah.
at the moment, I'm pretty open to just about anything like that. I'm kind of, hoping to see, as kind of these bigger opportunities that we've been talking about over the last half hour, as these kind of get to, closer to fruition where there is more, need for that communication between those, designers and brand companies and the tool design companies. I'm kind of hoping that there's like a role I can play in there to kind of help guide that. It's kind of one
Mhm.
thing that I've got in my bucket list of career goals. I want to see some of this stuff actually come to fruition before I eventually retire, because I think it's been such a slow burn in some ways, but it feels like I don't know if it's accelerating. I don't know if I have AI to thank or blame for that. And I think AI, to your point, is going to play another important part of this. But the better your workflow and your design process and your tool capabilities are, the better you're going to be able to utilize things like AI to even springboard you further, further down the road. So yeah, so I'm kind of hoping to eventually find a role to play in that to really help drive the industry into the next step.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I think, yeah, we share a lot of similar vision there and hope for the community. I think,
Yeah.
we're in an interesting spot, and it's still in a lot of ways like the good old days where it hasn't quite picked up the mainstream adoption, especially on the AR/VR side.
Oh
However,
yeah,
you can see the trends like moving in that direction, right? All the right investments are being made. The From a headset standpoint, like it's getting smaller, it's getting lighter, it's getting better in performance. It's still a ways away, unfortunately, from being like a mainstream, like everyday, smartphone
for
replacement.
sure. Yeah.
But it does still feel like that's the trend that it's moving. And once you get to that point, 3D content is going to become,
Oh yeah.
ubiquitous and a requirement. So for brands to get ahead of that now and utilize 3D in all the great places
Hmm.
they can in their product cycles, getting consumer feedback sooner, product visualization for the end user, configuration. Like there's so many great use cases for 3D just today, but
Yeah.
we're just on the, a stone's throw away from this wider demand
Yeah.
and need
Yeah. I
for
would agree.
3D. So to me, it feels like the great time to get in on the ground floor,
Oh yeah,
especially as you're
absolutely.
thinking about building out those tools to facilitate it.
And I got to tell you, off topic but on topic on that one. It's kind of uncomfortable for me to sit on a meeting with somebody whose VR headset game exceeds my own. You've got a bunch. I've only got six, so I I see you've got a
Yeah,
bunch
I mean,
behind you.
it's been a long, like, decade plus that I've been, working in this space, and then, you start collecting them as you do,
Yeah,
and I found that, IKEA sells these headlamp, displays. They,
nice.
can light up, and it's a good holder, but, yeah, for a
Oh,
while, I just
cool.
kinda had them in the closet and
I
thought,
like it.
"Hey, let's, make it a nice Zoom background."
Yeah,
But
well, you've given me ideas.
yeah.
Yeah, I've got back to the original Oculus Rift, the one that didn't even come with controllers, and you just use like
Yeah,
a
yep.
gamepad, up through. Mostly, I use Quest 3 today. It's just so convenient. It tethers to the desktop so well. Like I'll have Unreal Engine scenes up on my desktop in my headset, and then like get up and stand over there, and I can be in the scene, and then I can sit back down, and yeah, it's pretty nice.
Yeah,
So
it's a
yeah,
really solid device. My Quest 3,
you
like,
got
sitting
yours
right
right
over
there.
here, and yeah, I was testing some WebXR stuff today with
Mm,
it.
nice.
I think that's an interesting opportunity too, and that could be a whole 'nother
Yeah.
topic for a future podcast, but
Yeah.
being able to like just deliver these experiences through the web without having to be tied to any one particular platform, I
Yeah.
think that'll be important as we get past that kind of chicken and egg problem that,
Yeah.
there's a lot of games out there and the gaming adoption's been pretty good. But from
Yeah.
our
I would
standpoint
agree.
of visualization and customization and,
It
consumer
definitely seems
shopping,
more like a toy
not
to
much there
a
yet.
lot of those people. Yeah, a lot of those users.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but to be able to have that WebXR experience, on the web,
Yeah.
and, you can actually do that now, like, Google Model Viewer has a
Mm,
WebXR, like,
mhm.
button, and if you're in the headset, which that's what I was playing around with today, you can actually drop the 3D model the same way you do it on your phone. If you're in
Mm.
AR and you press the
Just
AR
into the
button,
space.
you can do it in VR, and it's even better, right? It's
Nice.
it's a lot of fun to compare it next to things that I've scanned
Mm.
and see them side by side.
Oh, cool.
'Cause the 2D phone interface, it's okay, but it's still looking through a camera,
Yeah.
whereas, like, the 3D VR headset, it's like, it's actually there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm pretty excited and optimistic for the future there.
That's cool. Yeah. Yeah, that's probably one we talk about later.
Excellent. Well, we made
Awesome.
it to the end of our segment, so thank you all for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody.